So in discussing game theory, Ridley's going to focus on this particular simplified version of the world, this particular game that has played an important and central role in the development of modern game theory, and that is the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the prisoner's dilemma is just a way of formulating a concrete version of this scenario of strategies, their costs and benefits in the simple interactive game. But the prisoner's dilemma basically describes situations in which there's a conflict between one's self-interest and the common good, so that choices that you make that maximize your self-interest aren't going to maximize the common good, and choices that you make that will maximize the common good aren't going to maximize your self-interest. And so Ridley's going to want to claim that the prisoner's dilemma presents theorists with the stark example of how to achieve cooperation among rational egoists, among people who are seeking to maximize their own subjective utility, that is, making the choices that are most likely to give them the most benefit personally. And as a result, it suggests that cooperation will evolve or develop in between rational agents, independent of taboos, moral constraints, or ethical imperatives. And so if you're a libertarian, you find this kind of appealing, this idea that as long as people are rational, they will cooperate. But it's not quite that simple. So remember, the egoist in this scenario is what we called the rational egoist in the egoism lecture. That is, this is a person who is seeking to maximize their subjective utility. That is, a person who's seeking to get the best outcome for themselves as a result of their actions. And in economics, the way that gets characterized is by talking about maximizing utility. And what is utility? Well, utility is just a product of, on the one hand, the value that you assign to a particular outcome, and on the other hand, the probability or likelihood that you can, through your actions, achieve that outcome. And so utility is just how likely it is that you'll get an outcome multiplied by how valuable that outcome is to you personally. And so in economics, one model of what it is to be rational is that people make choices that maximize their own subjective utility. So how does the prisoner's dilemma work? Well, in the vignette that gives us a sort of empirical or conceptual face on this set of choice strategies, what we have two individuals. And these individuals have been arrested. They're in separate rooms. They can't interact with each other. They don't know what each other are going to do. But they're faced with this choice. This choice that they're given is, look, either you testify against the other person or you don't. And each of them is going to have to choose between these two strategies. And in the context of the game, what is called cooperation is the strategy where you refuse to testify against the other person. So you're trying to cooperate with this other person. Now, the other person doesn't know what you're going to do, okay? And they can choose to cooperate, or they can choose to engage in the other strategy, which is usually called defection. And in defection, you opt to testify against the other person, okay? And each of the strategies has a payoff that you can expect to get should the world unfold in a particular way. And that payoff is dependent on the choices you make, but it's also dependent on the choices that the other person makes. And so if neither of you testifies against the other, if you both adopt that cooperation strategy, then you'll both get a year's sentence in prison. Okay? So that'll be the expected outcome if you both engage in this strategy of cooperation. And again, you don't know what the other person is going to do. However, if, say, the first person decides, look, I don't want to risk that the other person is going to cooperate, I instead am going to defect. I'm going to testify against the other person. Then the person who defects or testifies against the other person, they get off scot-free. They suffer no penalty. So it's the best individual outcome for them. The person they testify against, if they're trying to cooperate, they'll get 5 years, and that'll be the worst individual outcome. Okay? And so person 1 defects, well, person 2 cooperates, person 1 gets nothing, person 2 gets 5, and vice versa. If person 2 defects and testifies, and person 1 tries to cooperate, then person 2 gets no time in jail, and person 1 gets 5 years in jail. Now, if you both choose to defect, if you both adopt the strategy of offering testimony against each other, then you'll both get 3 years. So, initially, if you communicate, you would probably agree to the choice that made the most sense, that is to cooperate, to act in ways that produce the best outcome for both of you as a group. If you're devious, right, then you might be thinking to yourself, as long as that person cooperates, I can then defect and testify against them, and I'll get nothing, whereas they'll get 5 years. And so we have this conflict between your self-interest, what's the best outcome for the individual, and the common interest, what's the best outcome for everybody involved. And I symbolize that, or spell it out explicitly, in this little chart here. So we see the chart has person 1, person 2, and our outcomes for each person. So if person 1 defects, that is, person 1 chooses to testify against person 2, and person 2 cooperates, that is, they refuse to testify against person 1, then person 1 is going to get that best individual outcome, 0 years, whereas person 2 is going to get the worst individual outcome, 5 years in prison. Okay? So if person 1 defects, person 2 cooperates, person 1 gets their best outcome, person 2 gets their worst outcome. And likewise, if the roles are reversed, if person 2 decides to defect, to cooperate, to offer testimony, and person 1 decides to cooperate, then person 2 will get the best individual outcome of 0 years in prison, and person 1 will get the worst individual outcome of 5 years in prison. So if you have a mixed strategy where one of you defects and the other tries to cooperate, that will yield the best and worst individual outcomes for you respectively. If you both cooperate, that is, if you both refuse to testify against the other, then you get the second best individual outcome, both of you. And so that's the best outcome for the common good, for everybody involved. You'll each get a year in prison. It's not the best outcome individually, but it's the best outcome for both of you. No one has to suffer so that the other person gets a better outcome. Your interests are balanced against the other person's interests. Now, if you both defect, that is, if you both try and testify against each other, then you'll get the worst common outcome of both getting 3 years, which is the third best individual outcome. So you'll both have a worse individual outcome than you would have if you'd cooperated or if the other person had tried to cooperate while you defected. So that's the structure of the prisoner's dilemma and the various rewards that you get.